Hello and welcome. I'm Terry, one of the Consumer Technology Specialists at Mid-Continent Public Library, and this is part one of a three-part series that will help you create your own mailing labels. Even if you don't use address or shipping labels, you can use the same techniques that we're going to learn to create business cards, notebook dividers and tabs, file folder tabs, name badges, postcards, and more. Let's start by creating a sheet of return address labels. To begin, I've opened a blank document in Word, and then I'm going to go above the ribbon to the middle of the tabs and find the Mailings tab. When I click on Mailings, on the left, we can see that we've now got a Create group that includes envelopes and labels. And to the right of labels, we can see that the rest of that ribbon is really devoted to Mail Merge, which we'll learn about in parts 2 and 3 of our series. Well, let's click on the Labels button, which brings up the Envelopes and Labels dialog box. Now that we have the envelopes and labels dialog box open, let's start at the upper left where we can see that we have tabs for both envelopes and labels, which sort of reflects the Create group on the ribbon. And the Labels tab is the one that's active because that's the button that we selected. Below that, we have an address box where you would type in your return address. I'm just going to paste in a randomly generated name and address for our example today. Below that, we have the print section where we could print a full page of the same label, which is what I think we will mostly do. But you also have the option to print a single label, which we'll look at a little bit later. To the right of that, it tells me that I have an Avery US Letter 5160 address label as the default, and generally that is the one that I choose. But I know that return address labels are a slightly different number. So I'm going to click in this label area, which will bring up the Label Options dialog box. So starting in the upper left, it says printer information. And for the most part, I think everybody would select page printers because we now have sheets of labels and not continuous feed printers, which I used to make this selection when I had a dot matrix printer, but boy, that's been a long time ago now. So I think we will select page printers. And then below that, we have a section of label information where we need to select the label vendor. And this has defaulted to Avery US Letter, but as I click the drop down, we can see starting at the very top that Microsoft might be what your dialog box defaults to, or 3M is very popular as well. It might default to that. Certainly, Avery US Letter is a very common kind of label where you can find a lot of different places. But as I scroll down, you can see that Office Depot and farther down, Staples have also got their own brand of label that, depending on what store you visit, you might decide that those are what you need instead. All you need to do is look at the label package to figure out which ones you got. But for today, we'll go with the Avery US letter. And then below that, it has the product number. Now, Avery, well, most of them have just goo gobs of product numbers. So again, look on the package of labels that you've purchased to figure out what that product number is. And you can scroll through if you would like, but here's a fun tip. If I just click randomly on one of the selections and then I type in the number that I know or the one I see on the package, and you must type fairly quickly, I'm just going to put 5167, and it takes me to that choice in the list. So it saves you some time scrolling through and trying to figure out where that label is in the list. So there's our return address labels. And then over on the right, It gives us very basic information about those address labels, which is they're about a half inch tall and they're an inch and 3/4 wide. If I want more information, because I'm still not quite sure that that's what I want, in the lower left, there's a details button. Now, the details button can help you if you need to troubleshoot because you're not quite getting your labels to print correctly. And so you could adjust these numbers if you need to. But right now, this is telling us that the top margin of the sheet is a half inch, and then the labels start, and you would start printing. The side margin, so it's really the left and right sides, both have a third of an inch margin. The horizontal pitch is kind of interesting. You can sort of see it on the diagram here, where it's the left side of the first label, and then how far is it to the left side of the next label. Again, it tells us the label height and width, but probably more important for me anyway, is just the number of cross is 4 and the number down is 20. That's 80 labels on a sheet. I got that. That's what I want. So I'll click OK. Now we've pretty much figured out everything that we need on this dialog box, so we will click OK, which brings us back to our envelopes and labels dialog box. And again, we have now that it's a 5167 return address. In the lower left, we have two choices that we need to consider. The first one is print. Now, if I select print, it will print those return labels, but it just prints it on the sheet, and I don't even get to select a default printer. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the labels are going to print correctly. So you might consider going to New Document, which is what we're going to do. Oh yeah, and I'm really glad we did that. But now we have a full page of return address labels. Now that we have our labels showing up here, we can see that, oh, we're so glad that we did not click that print button, because in fact, the third line on each label is just running right off of the label. And the culprit is probably that default font that Microsoft uses, which is Calibri 11. Well, let's select everything. And to do that, as I see this, it's nothing more than a word table. So if I go to the upper part of a word table and on the left, there is a little button that looks like a plus sign, but in fact, it's four arrows pointing up, down, left, and right. When I click on that, it selects the entire table. And so now let's change our font. Well, let's see, that was 11. So let's try, nope, 10 is still kind of messing with that last line. Let's go to 9. Ooh, now 9 looks pretty good, but let's try 8 just to see. Now 8 is even smaller, but we're getting into sort of the mouse print region where it is almost too small to read. So let's go back to 9 and click on that. All that information fits really nicely on the labels. Well, let's double check. Let's go to File and Print. And then on the right, we can see our print preview, and it looks like everything is going to print fine. But here's the thing, we really want to print on a plain sheet of paper first, and then compare what we've printed on that plain sheet to how that is going to actually work with the label sheet that we have. Labels are always a bit of concern if you're printing them for the first time or if you haven't printed labels in quite a while. If your printer doesn't show you how to load label sheets, it's a really good idea to use plain paper first. You need to know if the labels should be placed away from you in the tray or toward you, and which direction they need to feed into that printer as well. Printers can get jammed if the labels are on the wrong side of the label sheet. They just kind of roll right off the sheet as they go through the rollers and stick to the rollers or even other internal parts. So here's a suggestion. To save yourself some aggravation, take that plain sheet of paper and mark the label side as, well, label side of the sheet, and then the other side as the plain one, or no labels on this side. Mark the top, which would be the side that you're going to put to feed first into the printer and also the bottom of that sheet as well. Then you're going to place your plain sheet in that tray how you think the labels are going to print, and note how you've laid that sheet in, and then print an example page. Now, if it prints the way you want, that's great, but if it didn't, note how you should make changes and then print another example sheet until you get the settings and the way you want those pages to be in the tray before you actually print your label sheets. Now that we know how to add the label sheet to the printer tray and how to successfully print our labels, we can close this document out and not save it, or we can go to File, Save As, give this document a name, and then anytime we want to bring up these labels and print more, we will be able to do that. Well, now let's shift gears just a little bit and let's create a sheet that will allow us to type different names and addresses. And to do that, we're going to start with a blank set of labels. So we'll go back up to the Mailings tab in the ribbon, and then on the left-hand side, we're going to go back to Labels, click it, and we get the envelopes and labels dialog box. Now notice in the address box, it's picked up the address that we had in there previously. We want to be sure to delete that so that we can have, blank labels in the sheet that we're creating. We want a full page of the same label, and then on the right it has defaulted to the 5160 address label, which is what I really want to use. If it's not correct, we would click this box, and just like before, we would select the vendor and then the number and type of label that we want. Down in the lower left, we'll click New Document, and now we have some new labels. Now I'm going to quickly copy and paste some names and addresses in so that you can kind of see how that works. But if you had your own document, you would just simply type all of this information in, and then you could save this document, give it a name, go to File, Print, and print. Now that we've created some labels and we've printed that sheet, I've grayed out the labels that we have now taken off of the sheet and actually used, say, on envelopes. And it's just for us to kind of have easier viewing of what's going on. Well, what if we don't want to waste the rest of the labels? Well, we have some options here. First of all, just a word of caution. Eventually, the heat starts getting to the sticky part of these labels. So I've heard recommendations of not reusing label sheets more than 2 or 3 times, but this would just be a second time. So if we want to print a second copy of the labels that we have printed here, and certainly there's room on the sheet, let me change our zoom a little bit so you can see the whole sheet. We could turn this page around so that we take the bottom of the label sheet and have it go into the printer first rather than the top of the sheet. That way we could use those labels on the bottom as well. What if I only want to print just one more label? Well, I have two choices to consider. First of all, if I only care about printing the information on the label and I don't care about adding that information and saving it in an existing document, I could do the following. Now, this is something that I've just kind of learned with practice is, first of all, place that label sheet in the printer tray the way you want it to go. That way you won't forget. Then from there, we're going to go up to the Mailings tab just above the ribbon and go to the left where we have the Labels button and click it. Now you'll notice that it has kept some of our old information, so we need to, in that address box, put in our new information. Below the address box, we have the print section, and we've been selecting full page of the same label, but now we're going to go to single label. Now, single label asks for a row and a column. Rows are horizontal, columns are vertical. Row 1 has already been used up. We've used all those labels. But row 2 has a blank label right here where I'm pointing. So we need to change that row to 2. Now the columns are even a little more confusing, but again, just kind of figuring things out here. Um, the columns are counted by the number of labels, not by the spaces between the labels. So in this case, we have column 1. This is column 2. So again, we need to change that. So now we have row 2, column 2, and a reminder in the lower left that before printing, be sure to put those labels in your feeder. And then we click print in the very lower left, and we have now printed that single label. The problem is, or perhaps the drawback is, that information is not saved anywhere. That leads us to, well, what other options do we have? Let's print one more single label. And again, the labels that we've already printed and used are grayed out so we know where we are on our label sheet. And we have two possibilities of ways of doing this. So the first one is we can type the information into the document and then copy it, and it might even show up in the address box, but if not, we can certainly paste it in. Or we can type the information in the address box first, we can copy it, and then after printing, paste it into the label document. Well, we're going to take that first choice. We'll type the information in the document and then copy it. From here, we're going to go up above the ribbon to the Mailings tab. We'll go to the Labels button, click on that, and the new address is already in that address box, but if it weren't, we could paste it in. From here, we can go down to the print section where we select single label, and we may need to move this box a little bit so we can count. We're definitely on row 2, and this time we're on label 1, 2, 3, so it's column 3. And then we get our reminder to be sure to put that label sheet in the printer, and then we can print. Be sure to explore our online resources at mymcpl.org/online learning, where you'll learn about such wonderful resources as Universal Class, lynda.com, Who Knew It, and Learning Express Library. Be sure to tune in next week, where Paige will present Need Food, Grocery Apps to the Rescue, and also be sure to tune in again for part 2 of our 3-part series. That's August 26th, where we will use Excel as a data source to create mailing labels.